Like that, they lied to us.
Once the Tibetan army had surrendered, part of the policy of the Chinese Communist Army was not to pillage and loot. You don't antagonize them unnecessarily when you're establishing your control. There was a period when they sought the reluctant cooperation of the Tibetans.
Implementing communist reforms, the Chinese army began seizing land and property in eastern Tibet and redistributing it to the peasants, much as they had done throughout China.
Problem was, when the Chinese went to a Tibetan village, the landlords were the clergy. And when they attacked the clergy for being parasites because they didn't work and lived off the labor of the others, the people didn't respond in the same way as they would if the army had arrested a rather venial landlord.
When the attacks became apparent on their religion, when the monks were held up to ridicule, when restrictions were put on the monasteries, people became more fearful and began to see the reality of Chinese communism.
They took a rope like this, and then they tied the Lama like this and that. They peed and defecated and threw their urine and stool on the Lama. It greatly saddened us. They raided all the wealth of our ancestors. The Chinese said there is no religion. There is no God. There are no spirits.
For us Tibetans, we want to preserve everything that Lord Buddha has said, which is the essence of our life. Since it is like taking our soul from the body, we couldn't stand it, and that's why we formed a resistance force against them, to save our religion.
Tensions mounted as Chinese battles with the Tibetan resistance took place ever nearer to Lhasa. Refugees from the violence in eastern Tibet were arriving by the thousands with shocking accounts of Chinese brutality. By March of 1959, the situation was explosive.
When it was believed that there was a threat to the life of His Holiness, the monasteries decided to raise a volunteer army of monks in case they were needed.
Taking up arms and fighting does go against a monk's vows. We put aside our vows and prepared to oppose them and to die fighting. This was done for the future survival of Buddha's teachings, our community, and our culture.
The Dalai Lama knew that Tibetans would fight to the death to protect him. He later wrote that he felt there was only one way to avoid massive loss of life. Disguised as a common soldier, the Dalai Lama slipped out of the palace at night and began the long, dangerous escape over the Himalayas to India. Days later, the Chinese army bombed the Dalai Lama's palace, and Tibetans across the country erupted in revolt. The Tibetan uprising was crushed and became the justification for a ruthless crackdown against all resistance to Chinese rule in Tibet.
The figures are roughly 87,000 Tibetans killed in the winter of 1959 alone in central Tibet. After the repression of that revolt, Tibet was entirely sealed from the outside world for a period of a quarter century. During this quarter century, immense suffering occurred to the Tibetan people.
In 1960, the International Commission of Jurists, an independent human rights organization, concluded that China was guilty of committing genocide in Tibet. The Commission's report found evidence that murder, arbitrary imprisonment, and torture were inflicted on the Tibetans on a large scale, and that children were indoctrinated to turn against their parents and reject their religion and customs.
Examples from real life teach these children the distinction between good people and bad people.
The spread of communist doctrine in Asia provoked the United States to seek new alliances in the Cold War.
American involvement with the Tibetan cause began as a covert involvement with the CIA training of Tibetan guerrillas in the early 50s. Tibetans were flown secretly across the Pacific, covertly trained at Camp Hale, Colorado, in mountain warfare, and then shipped back to Asia.
The training they gave us was guerrilla warfare, communication, ammunition, and paratrooping.
The older generation, they're not just coming from one country to another country. It's from one age to another age. We were thrown across 3 centuries. And they didn't understand how the modern world worked. And we thought it was in our interest to keep everything secret. So we fought a secret war.
Barley is the staple grain of the Tibetan plateau, but Mao Zedong ordered the Tibetans to plant wheat, which was favored in China. The wheat crop failed in Tibet's harsh climate. According to Chinese statistics, in some areas of Tibet, nearly 50% of the population starved to death. Mao's disastrous agricultural policies led to the deaths of an estimated 30 million Chinese between 1959 and 1962, more than Stalin's purges and the Nazi Holocaust combined.
Tibet was cloaked by a wall of propaganda. China portrayed Tibet as a socialist paradise on the roof of the world, and in fact, hundreds of thousands of Tibetans were dying.
This is the first time in thousands of years that the Tibetan peasants are able to grow crops for themselves. The oppression and exploitation which the Tibetan peasants suffered for centuries have now been relegated to the past. In truth, springtime has come to Tibet.
The figures for the loss of life for all of Tibet since the occupation started are 1.2 million, which is 1 out of every 6 Tibetans, and they died as a result not just of armed conflict, but of starvation and imprisonment as well.
Prisons where Tibetan resistors had been sentenced to hard labor became death camps.
Thousands of people were lined up and posters tied around their necks describing their crimes, and then they were taken to be killed. One by one, they were made to stand on the edge of a pit and shot and covered with dirt even before the person stopped breathing. I have never felt so sad as those days.
100 of us were taken to the factory. We became like family and came to love and care for each other. From 100 women in their 20s, only 4 managed to survive. All the others died of starvation. In the whole world, I can't imagine such suffering. There was nothing there but bones. Our eyes had sunken. We didn't dare look at each other. They cried and groaned for a while and then died.
Adi saved a piece of cloth from each of her friends' clothing, which she stitched into a quilt.
I wanted to keep it with me to show to others, to tell them how much we suffered. Whenever I am sleeping on my bed in my house, with great comfort, I always think of the space in the prison and all my friends there. I pray that those who died will never have to suffer like that, ever again.
Buddhists basically believe in the dominance of benevolent power in the universe. That the force of evil is an accident, is ignorance, is based on error and therefore ultimately weaker. This sense of the faith in goodness that the Buddhist has is very crucial to making them not become cynical and not to become despair.
In 1966, Mao Zedong launched the Cultural Revolution, declaring that a new modern China would gloriously arise by the destruction of everything old.
The Cultural Revolution, that 10-year period when Chinese went mad in destroying their own cultural traditions. I don't think it ever happened in any other society that the powerful minds as well as dedicated youth to say that we have to get rid of our past.